Ikim Inspirasi Inforia Islami. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya wal mursalin. Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabi ajma'in. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a very good evening to Ikim Radio listeners. You are with me again, Annie Zahura Abdul Aziz, your host for today's episode of Open Forum. Thank you for tuning in to IKIM Radio and also to those who are watching us through our Facebook page this evening. So inshallah, in today's episode, Alhamdulillah, we are fortunate to have with us online, all the way from the United States, we have Professor Dr. Muqtadar Khan, Professor at the Department of Political Science and International Relations, University of Delaware. Assalamualaikum, Prof. How are you doing?
Walaikum salam, Sister Annie. Thank you very much for inviting again. And my salam and slightly late Eid Mubarak to all your listeners in Malaysia and other places.
Right. Thank you for being with us again in our new season of Open Forum, Prof. In the last season, we invited Prof. Muqtadar to actually talk about good governance in Islam, the philosophy of Ihsan. And in that 2 episodes we had last season, you share your views on the topic and also some insights from the book that you have written on that particular title, yeah, Prof? Before I proceed further with our discussion, let me just briefly reintroduce our guests for those who missed our previous interviews with Prof. Muqtadar Khan last season. So Dr. Muqtadar Khan is a professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Delaware. He researches and teaches Islam, governance and international relations. He obtained his PhD in international relations, political philosophy, and Islamic political thought from Georgetown University. From 2017 to 2019, he was academic director of the State Department's National Security Institute. And from 2019 onwards, he is academic director of the State Department's American Foreign Policy Institute. Prof, you actually founded the Islamic Studies program at the University of Delaware and was its first director. And you have authored several books, and one of the books I've mentioned previously is The Good Governance, the Political Philosophy of Ihsan. You also authored American Muslims, Bridging Faith and Freedom, Jihad for Jerusalem, Identity and Strategy in International Relations, and edited a couple of books, Islamic Democratic Discourse and Debating Moderate Islam, The Geopolitics of Islam and the West. We know that you frequently comment on, media, mainstream media such as BBC, CNN International, Fox and VOA TV. But interestingly, you also have your own YouTube channel, yeah, Prof, which is Conversations. And I think, for those who actually who like to watch discussions and also sharing by Prof. Muqtadar Khan and also your other guests in the program, you can actually tune in and subscribe to Conversations on the YouTube channel, yeah, Prof. So inshallah today we are going to talk about a topic which is I think is very much relevant in the current situation that we are today, not just as Muslims. I think it's a concern, it's a global concern everywhere in the world. We are going to talk about the many faces of Islamophobia. And I think when we talk about Islamophobia, maybe we can start by actually defining Islamophobia, Prof. So if you may proceed with the discussion.
So the idea of Islamophobia, the word itself was coined in the 1990s. Usually credit is given to a British commission called Runnymede, which actually published a first report, I think it was in early 1990s, about Islamophobia in Britain, where they found that for no reason at all, there was a bias against Muslims. So for example, to give you an example would be that you could send 2 CVs, curriculum vitas, for a job application, identical CVs. One name is Michael and the other name is Muhammad. And then you see that Michael gets more calls than Muhammad. And some people even did experiments where once Michael got an interview he went there and he's dressed like a Muslim with a long beard and a cap, and suddenly you find that he doesn't get the job. And somebody called Muhammad, who is clean shaven and doesn't wear a cap, etc., it does not look visibly as Muslim, would get the job. So there were a lot of experiments and research done in the 1990s to make the point that there is an irrational fear of Islam and Muslims. The word phobia really means fear. But the thing is that from a political perspective, as the Muslims in the West started, two things have happened in the last 20, 30 years. The population of Muslims in the West has increased significantly, and they have entered mainstream politics and cultural activities, and they have become influential to some extent. And there's also a lot of anti-Muslim anger in the society for various reasons, for 9/11 and terrorism and violence and wars in the Middle East, etc. So as a result of that, Muslims who are active in Western countries wanted to have a term to signify that there is a bias against Muslims in the society, even though they claim to be democratic and everyone is treated equally, at least on the paper. And so they chose the word Islamophobia following that particular report that came out in England. But the idea is that there was already a similar concept in Western political politics, you could say, the concept of anti-Semitism. So what anti-Semitism implies is that it's an irrational hatred of Jews. You hate Jews because they are Jews, period. So it's like saying that you would be friendly with a person called Noah and you're good friends for like a few months, and then suddenly you discover that Noah is Jewish, and then you stop meeting the person, etc. So you like the person for who that person is, but the moment you discover that person is Jewish, then you might even beat them up or get away from them. So these were the experiences that Jews were having in Western societies, and of course, Holocaust also happened in Europe, etc. So the idea was that for no reason, people were hating a specific group because they belong to a particular group identity. So that was the idea of anti-Semitism. But for some reason, the word phobia is used when we talk of similar attitude towards Muslims. So it's like fear of Muslims as opposed to hatred. But you could say that today, when we talk of Islamophobia, both in academic circles where the definition is fine-tuned, as well as in the public sphere, when we say, oh, this is an Islamophobic policy, or that is an Islamophobic politician, what we mean is a complex set of emotions and a complex set of attitudes. So when we say something or somebody is Islamophobic, what we mean to say is they seem to have a contempt towards Muslims and the religion of Islam. They have hatred for them, for Muslims, and the religion of Islam. And then there is also this idea that there is this perception that things associated with Islam are inferior. So there is a superiority, inferiority attitude. And you will find this kind of Islamophobia even within Muslim societies too. So people who live in urban areas look down on conservative Muslims from the rural areas. People who sometimes are not religiously observant may look down upon people who say wear hijab or not. So you'll find this even just looking down upon Muslims or observing Muslims, which is also, I think, a form of Islamophobia. Now, increasingly in the US, because of the emergence of the critical race theory as something very important, some scholars are arguing that Islamophobia is also a form of racism. So that is an interesting argument because which we need some empirical evidence to say that people who hate Muslims think that Muslims belong to a different race. But nevertheless, these are the ways in which we define Islamophobia. It is contempt for Muslims, it is perception of inferiority towards Muslims, it is a hatred of Muslims, And also, to some extent, there is an unfounded fear of Muslims. So, for example, if you after 9/11, people were afraid to fly on planes because if they thought Muslim-looking people, if people talked in Arabic. I actually once a national security agency, a government police force, contacted me saying we found this particular handkerchief on the plane, and they had detained the guy, and the poor guy was trying to compose really bad poetry for his wife or girlfriend in Urdu. So he was sitting in the plane and he was just writing in Urdu, trying to compose a two-liner to impress his wife or girlfriend.
Mm-hmm.
And just because the script was Arabic, he was detained. So this is a fear. This is an irrational fear. It's not a security measure. They have no evidence that he is connected with any terrorist groups or anything. It's just that he manifested a quality that is seen as Islamic. So there's sudden fear that he's terrorist. So there have been slogans in Western society here saying that not every terrorist, not every Muslim is a terrorist, but all terrorists are Muslims. So this is a very straight up example of how Islamophobic slogans have emerged in the society. So there are a lot of these manifestations of these things in society. That's what we mean by Islamophobia.
Interestingly, when you've mentioned about Islamophobia is about this irrational fear, and there is a possibility of actually ignorance in this sense as well, Prof, with regard to what Islam is. So you've been in a society which the majority are people of other faith, and Muslims in US, for example, are considered as a minority group there. What are the different forms of Islamophobia that you see happening, or what you can maybe explain or share with our listeners with regard to this different forms of Islamophobia?
So, so I started working on Islamophobia more than nearly 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and and I also hosted the first conference between Muslims and U.S. government at the Brookings Institute in 2004 or 5.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and it was interesting to see how every government official who spoke at the conference, we had people from the newly created Department of Homeland Security, we had people from the Foreign Policy Establishment, and we had people from the FBI, and then we have many Muslim leaders. And across the board, the government simply denied that there was no Islamophobia in America.
Mm-hmm.
People did not like Muslims for any reason. And then there were all these subtle hints that if people are afraid of Muslims, it is understandable because of terrorism and 9/11 happened, and so on and so forth. But now there is complete acknowledgement. You can see there was a Time magazine cover, is America Islamophobic? So now American politicians themselves use the word to Islamophobia. So when President or the candidate Trump running for a campaign made a promise of Muslim ban,
Yeah,
it
yeah,
was
we remember that.
it was immediately labeled as an Islamophobic statement. And when
Yeah.
it became policy, actually, he got it through the Supreme Court and kind of made the argument that it's not religious discrimination. It was clearly an Islamophobic policy, right? And that was the first thing that Biden revoked as soon as he became president. He had made that promise to Muslims, and he kept that promise. But uh, in the early days, the way I would describe the manifestation of Islamophobia as there are two ways in which it used to show. One is episodic. So it would happen, it may not happen. Like you're coming back from Canada, they see too many hijabs in the van, they will stop it and they will search it a bit more. So if there were no beards and hijabs, they probably would have not searched the van so much more. And the next van comes with same number of hijabs, same number of beards, but he doesn't search that van, right? He lets it go. So this is an example of an episodic thing. However, there is also systemic Islamophobia, which means every van which is coming, which has hijabs and beards in it, they will be stopped and searched, everyone systematically. Now you can see that there is a policy or a guideline or some kind of it's not just that that person who is at the border is doing this. So we had both kinds of Islamophobia. Some international episode happened. Al Qaeda did something in Turkey, and then there is a hate crime. Somebody shouts at a woman in the parking lot. So this is episodic thing. It is triggered by something that has happened. And so,
Yeah.
for example, when somebody goes and kills a school teacher in France, right, uh,
Mhm.
for showing posters of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in the classroom, then there are other backlashes, not just in France, but other parts of the world. So this is what I call as triggered episodic Islamophobic moments. But what Macron is doing in France, that is a systemic Islamophobia. He's making
Yeah.
policies, he's changing laws. And that is the more dangerous thing because it becomes a structural phenomenon. So you would have, it's like talking about structural racism, which means you have racism without people being racist. You could have a lot of nice people, but the rules and regulations of the system are biased towards it. So for example, if there are some kind of extra visa restrictions for people coming from Muslim countries, as opposed to Muslim people coming from non-Muslim countries, or if you look at the statistics and say, oh, okay, in the state of Delaware, 1% of the population is Muslims. But when we look at government appointments, if you look at prominent placements, etc., Muslims are less than 0.25%. So they are underrepresented. So there is a structural bias against Muslims. A part of it could be that Muslims are not applying for the jobs. We see this even in India. So that is there. And then now we see a different level of Islamophobia, which is outright open hatred of Muslims. I mean, there is no shame among the politicians. They call for killing of Muslims just because they are Muslims. And you see this kind of Islamophobia in India with the rise of Hindu nationalism, which is latent. Uh, uh, we need a new word. It's Islamophobia on steroids, and it is something that is rewarded by the society, even in a society which is allegedly democratic. So a political leader could make Islamophobic statements and not punished, instead get rewarded and go from being a minister of a state to become the prime minister of the country where there is genuine violence. So Islamophobia has reached in some places. You saw that in Myanmar with the Rohingyas. You see that
Yeah.
now in China with the Uyghurs movement. You saw that in Sri Lanka with the attacks on Muslims, which have now kind of dissipated. You see that in India. You see that bias even in the way Palestinians are treated, not just in Israel, but across the board. So there is a lot of violence, outright violence. You saw the way, when the Ukraine war broke out, the way Europeans welcomed refugees from Ukraine and the way they had built walls and barbed wires to keep refugees of Syria out. So
Yeah.
the difference in the way Europe treated the refugees from Ukraine and the way they treated the refugees from Syria is another sign of Islamophobia, where Islamophobia is institutionalized. It becomes government policy, and it is mass hysteria, you could argue. That is how Islamophobia manifests. Increasingly, is Islamophobia in the United States, while it is there and there are some systemic aspects to it, it has reduced significantly. And you can see that by the large number of Muslims who are getting elected. We have three Muslims in the parliament. Ilhan Omar wears hijab. She's an incredible target of all Islamophobes. If you want to know who are the Islamophobes in America, you should see who is spending money to make her lose her elections. And she's a hijabi woman, the first hijabi member of the US Parliament. But at many levels, also, you're seeing the state level, the city level, you're seeing more and more Muslims run. In my own state, one of my former students is now the first hijabi African American Muslim woman member of the state assembly. So the fact that people are coming out and voting to Muslims who are openly Muslim tells you that there is an opposite trend also, that there is an acceptance of Muslims. While there is also, then there is Donald Trump who says we should have a Muslim ban. So you see both trends, at least in the US. It is quite possible you may not see those trends in other places, but recently in England, Sargent, I forget his last name, one of the ministers in the British government, was initially considered as one of the forerunners to replace Boris Johnson
Yeah.
as prime minister. So it is quite possible. It's not going to happen because he's out. But 10 days
Mm-hmm.
ago, there was a possibility that you could have had a Muslim prime minister of Britain. So,
Mm-hmm.
so you can say that in Western societies, both acceptance and Islamophobia coexist.
Interestingly, you've said about, there's a reduction. I mean, especially in America, you see that reduction of Islamophobia tendencies, especially in the society and so on. Um, my question to you: does Islamophobia only exist in Muslim minority societies in Western countries? You know, do you see any other places where Muslim majority do exhibit this kind of Islamophobia tendencies?
Yeah. Before that, I also wanted to point out that the mayor of London is Khan.
Yes.
London is perhaps one of the most important Western cities, and to have a Muslim mayor who's elected,
Yeah.
so it definitely tells you that not all of London is not Islamophobic. There are majority of them are not.
Mm-hmm.
So now this question, I'm politically, I want to be politically cautious in answering this question because uh, a few years ago, in one Muslim country, there was a lot of funding available for projects on Islamophobia.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a proposal to make a television series. I will not name the country. If you guess it, it's fine. To make a television series about Islamophobia worldwide.
Mm-hmm.
And they wanted me to be one of the writers of the television series and also one of the persons who would narrate. And so I traveled to this Muslim country and I looked at it. And while it was being pitched as a global phenomena, I noticed that most of the episodes were designed about people who were unwilling to accept uh, a major public role for Islam in that country. So
Mm-hmm.
basically, Muslims who were not Islamists were being labeled Islamophobic.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very disturbed. I said, look, if this is Afghanistan, I would not want to live in a government of by the Taliban. And the Taliban can say till they turn blue that we are implementing Sharia. I don't want to live in a Sharia that is defined by the Taliban. You want to call me Islamophobic? I've been working for Islam all my life. So this is not Afghanistan. This is a different country. But what I'm trying to say is that when we make the argument that there is Islamophobia in Muslim majority countries, we should be very careful that Islamists should are trying to weaponize it against their opponents who may be moderates, secularists, or even Sufis. Who
Mm-hmm.
basically we don't want people who want to impose Sharia on others by force or law. Uh, to treat those who want freedom and democracy in their societies as Islamophobic. So that is why I'm hesitant to say. But yes, there are people in Muslim majority societies who are viscerally anti Islam. We would also ask this question whether Islamophobia means to be opposed to the religion of Islam or to dislike Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
If it's in the West, it is both.
Mm-hmm.
People may just dislike Muslims because, oh my God, look at them, look at the way they dress, look what they eat. They're all brown or black or this and that, right? So if they dislike Muslims because they are Muslims, we would still call it Islamophobia.
Yeah.
And the intersectionality of Islamophobia as racism is they may dislike somebody who is black and Muslim or brown and Muslim. And so, even in the person who dislikes them, there is no clarity as to why he dislikes the person, because the person is brown, or because the person is an immigrant, or is the person Muslim. They may not know any one of those. Sister, have you? Oh, you're still there. So, so that is one thing. So in the Muslim countries, if we have the broader conception of Islamophobia, disliking Muslims because they are Muslims, then you can't accuse Muslims of being Islamophobic, because they are Muslims too, right?
Yeah.
Uh, but if Islamophobia is defined a bit more narrowly, which is to hate the religion of Islam, to despise people who practice it and observe it, then yes, there exists like, so for example, I face it all the time from lots of Muslims who say, "Oh my God, you're so educated, so intellectual, etc., blah blah blah, and you pray and you fast." So that is a kind of Islamophobia where they have contempt for all religious people, right? So these
Yeah.
people who are like that towards Muslims would be in the same way towards Hindus and Christians and Jews who are observing that. So those are the two kinds of Islamophobia that I can think of in Muslim majority state. Those people who want to weaponize it for political purposes and say that if you're opposed to Islamic rules or Islamic law, then you're Islamophobic. Like Imran Khan can now accuse anybody who doesn't vote for him as saying you're Islamophobic, you're pro-America, and stuff like that. So that is nonsense and rubbish. It weakens the struggle against Islamophobia. We must remember that any concept that is used loosely loses its salience, right? So, for example, some politician is making a legitimate argument that we should be very careful about bringing refugees from countries where there is tremendous terrorism going on, right? Uh, let's say that some Russians are running out of Russia. And if you take them all, how do you know that many of them are not agents of the Russian government? So you need to go through the security check before you do that, right? So, but if you take that politician and say, oh no, this politician, because he says we should be careful about people coming from the war zones, uh, is Islamophobic or racist, that will, in a democratic society, that argument will weaken the very concept of Islamophobia. So I think people have to be also very careful in how they use it, and then, because if you use it too much, it will become useless, especially if accusation after accusation is not credible, then people will not take Islamophobia serious. And Islamophobia is a serious problem. It undermines lives, it can destroy your lives, it can act as a glass ceiling for progress and development. Uh, there are consciously people are Islamophobic sometimes, and sometimes they are not. And sometimes they are systemic biases. So, for example, in American universities, you will rarely find a non-Jewish person as director of Jewish studies, but it's not always that the director of Islamic studies is Muslim. And they will not even think that this is a structural Islamophobic policy. It's like saying that the director of women's studies is a man.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you call it sexist? So there are some of these subtle levels. So it is there, it undermines, it hurts the students who are then they assume that this Islamic studies program therefore is not very serious. Anybody can be director. There is no commitment to Islam itself. So Muslim students will definitely be away from that program. They will not participate as much, etc. So that's just one example, but people who are being hired in for jobs, that is one major area where Islamophobia hurts people in Western society, a discrimination at the job market, and maybe even discrimination in admissions, etc. But like I said, there is the opposite trend also. So you will find that now every poster, every brochure has a hijabi in it. So if you are the hijabi student at that university, you are popular than others by virtue of being a Muslim, not because you're brilliant or anything, just because you wear hijab. They want you in the photograph because it says we are inclusive, we are diverse, etc. So there are both trends out there,
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, Prof. For the first part of our discussion on the topic, the many faces of Islamophobia, I think you have defined Islamophobia, and you have also explained in terms of there are forms of Islamophobia that we should be alerted about, and when we're talking about Islamophobia, there are many other areas that I think we can discuss, and inshallah, in our second part of our discussion on Open Forum, we will share with our listeners with regard to this. So for that, I would like to thank Prof. Muqtadar Khan for being with us today to talk about the topic, the many faces of Islamophobia. Thank you to my producer, Haja Mazlina Ismail, and to our fellow listeners. Do you tune into Open Forum next week for the second part of our conversation with Prof. Muqtadar Khan. May Allah SWT protect us always, inshallah. And with that, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Prof.
Alaikum salam to you and salam alaikum to all of your listeners. And I look forward to our next